Morning and a warm welcome to the 25th meeting of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2025. The only item on our agenda is to take evidence of an inquiry into transparency of intergovernmental activity and its implications for parliamentary scrutiny. We have two apologies for committee today from Patrick Harvey and George Adam. So we are joined in the room by Professor Thomas Horsley, Professor of Law, University of Liverpool, Professor Nicola McEwen, Professor of Public Policy, University of Glasgow, Professor Colin Reid, University of Dundee, and David Thompson, Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation. And we also have online Dr Paul Anderson, Senior Lecturer in International Relations and Politics, Liverpool John Moores University. So a warm welcome to you all this morning. We're going to move straight to questions. Just a general question, following the 2024 general election, the new UK government announced its intention to reset devolution. What progress do you think has been made in delivering that reset? And perhaps I could come to Nicola first.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. So I would say that a reset is a process, not an event. And I think what we've seen in that process of resetting relations is a culture change. So as I understand it, and it's very difficult because of the lack of transparency, but as I understand it, there is a lot more willingness to share information. I think officials at the UK government have a bit more ministerial permission, in a sense, to share in a way that, in contrast to what it was like before the general election under the previous administration. So I think there's definitely a lot more engagement and positive mood music around the relationship. But cultural shift will only take you so far. And I think some of the challenges that were there previously that had contributed to the difficulties in the relationship, and we'll come on to talk about some of those, like UK Internal Market Act, like the fallout from Brexit, lots of different things that have contributed to deteriorating the relationship. Those things are still there. So we've had a response to the UK review. It hasn't really addressed the issues that this committee had or the Scottish Government had. And we still are, as I understand it, we're still awaiting a resolution to bolstering and strengthening the Sewell Convention. So all of those issues that were there before are still there. So culture only takes you so far.
Okay, can I go to Paul online?
Sure, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think Nicola's right. I think what we've seen so far principally is a change in tone. And I think certainly in 2024, the rhetoric and the mood music was fairly positive, with sort of positive notes from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government. But I think that has slightly deteriorated as things have gone on, and events have caused this. So we saw, for example, the issue around the UK government's negotiations with the European Union, particularly around points of fisheries, where the Scottish Government were not involved or indeed updated until what seemed to be the last minute on these issues. So I think the rhetoric has certainly improved since the previous government, but there are still issues. I think tangibly as well that the creation of the new structures, like the Council of the Nations and the regions, I think signals a sort of engagement by the UK government to formalise this process. Now I note, for example, that the Scottish Government has questioned the value of this forum and sort of engagement, wider engagement perhaps, for example, specifically with the mayors of combined authorities in England. But I think what it does signal is the sort of the UK government willing to formalise and have more engagement with the devolved governments and partners. Those arrangements are still in their infancy, and there are still issues that need to be ironed out. But I think there has been, since 2024, a slight change and certainly a notable change in both the rhetoric and that willingness to engage with devolved partners.
Thank you. Mr Thompson, do you want to give an industry view?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I guess my interest here is really to try and get across the impact of the intergovernmental relations on businesses in the food and drink sector, but I think probably in general as well. Certainly from the case of the rhetoric, I would agree with the others that the rhetoric has been more positive, down to, at the very least, the previous Secretary of State for Scotland and the Deputy First Minister. So all of that seems positive, but as an outside observer, you know, we don't necessarily see that lasting beyond personal relationships and that initial warmness, in particular as we go into an election period in Scotland and in Wales next year. So if I was advising businesses, I would say, you know, watch what they do, not what they say in terms of that. So also as an outside observer, having seen a little bit of loosening up of civil service relations, I think there has been that, but I think it has limits, and there are still, as others have expressed, still significant frustrations, probably on each side.
Okay, Professor Reid.
I think the only thing I'd add to what's already been said is to emphasise that it can be a very fragmented picture, that even before the reset, in some areas there was good collaboration, in others there wasn't. That pressure of politics and business can mean that things suddenly go ahead quickly for pressures in London or in Edinburgh and so on. So although you can talk in generalisation, it is going to be topic by topic, issue by issue.
Okay. Professor Horsley.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would only add to endorse maybe a couple of points. I think what's been said is absolutely true. It's very much a process. There's been a cultural shift. I think if you were to look at some of the detail, there are points of tension that have been raised, including things that were set out as specific objectives in relation to the reset. We've mentioned the Seoul Convention MOU, for example. There are other aspects as well. I would probably say that these aren't insignificant points of tension, so they are one to watch. But perhaps my main point here to add is just to reinforce that this reset doesn't reflect legally or constitutionally any dramatic change. It's still very much grounding intergovernmental relations in the sort of political sphere, which, as we've heard before, makes them vulnerable to changes in political thinking and actions here. And I'm sure we'll come back to develop that point later this morning. But thank you.
If I could just follow up on that issue of the political sphere, obviously leading up to the elections that we have next year in Wales and Scotland, that is evident in discourse and what's happening, and perhaps Mr Alexander's reports from the Labour conference, which is happening at the moment, that there's there does seem to be a level of political interchange in what's happening at the moment. Have you seen any difference between the relationship with the Scottish Government and the relationship with the Welsh Government, given that they're both the same party of government in control? Does anyone want to come in?
I mean, I would say, if I'll speak maybe to one example. I think if we look at the Welsh Government and its approach publicly to the internal market, I think you'll see in its official response, for example, to the UK Government's review, you'll see that there is a shared willingness to engage, I think, quite openly with some of the changes. The move to the common frameworks is the primary instruments now to manage regulatory difference, and that's been publicly expressed. But at the same time, there is still public opposition to the Act itself, and of course that is, as you mentioned, Labour in the Senate and obviously now in the UK. So I think there's still a defence of what they see as being devolved interests, and I think that transcends any sort of cross-party alliance, if you like, in terms of the broader Labour family. So I think that I would speak to that certainly with respect to Wales.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? Yeah, Mr Thompson.
So, as a real-world example, and being very cognisant of the court case, the deposit return system at this current state is one where Scotland, England and Northern Ireland have all now agreed on interoperability. Wales have not yet in the full term. They want to go further and harder. There's been recent announcements from the Welsh Government that show they've begun to come a little bit more into the fold. But it's a very real example of where there was significant difficulty here in Scotland, where despite the fact that the administrations are the same in England and Wales, there has not been the level of agreement that one might expect in order to deliver that across the whole of the UK in a way that works for business.
Thanks. Anyone else? Yep, Professor Reid.
I'd just say it's slightly at a tangent, but with the elections coming up, it raises the issue of timings and the different schedules and cycles of the parliaments, both even within the year, the different times of recess and the break that's going to come. Because I think it's underestimated how much inconvenience, practical problems, the mismatch of timings causes in trying to operate smoothly the various mechanisms there are.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move to questions from the committee, and I'm going to go first to Mr Brown.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm just thinking how difficult it must be to take a kind of academic approach to this when so much of it really comes down to political will and the politics behind it all. I don't think you could explain intergovernmental relations without reference to politics. It's just, I think, to the public, just a hot mess, something they won't even try to comprehend because it's not governed by any rationale across the piece. However, I just wonder, it seems as well that the UK internal, first of all, going back to devolution, of course, we were told that the Seoul Convention would be enshrined in law. That's what people were told before they voted in the referendum, and that was ditched immediately afterwards. And that kind of bad faith, I think, has continued since. But the Internal Market Act, which is opposed both by the Welsh and the Scottish governments and by this Parliament, has taken further the extent to which the UK government can involve itself in devolved matters. And just as one recent example, last week, the UK government announced a very substantial amount of cash to go out across the UK through the Pride in Place initiative, which was not the subject of any consultation with the Scottish Government, which will involve spending in local areas, the establishment of committees or boards across the country. No real criteria as to how the money is to be spent, not using SIMD or any other measures. There's been no consultation with COSLA, nor reference to the granted expenditure formula for local government. And I just wonder, if there's not any consultation there, and if we have, you would have thought that a Labour government, which was responsible initially for the establishment of devolution, would have wanted to respect devolution, and which I think also decried the predecessor Levelling Up Fund, wouldn't have done this. But the fact that it has done this, what implications do you think that has for intergovernmental relationship? And does it not blow out the water any idea of a substantive reset rather than just rhetoric sitting alongside actions which don't mirror that? I know it's quite a loaded question, but interested to hear any answers on the implications of the Pride in Place initiative.
So, that's all right, that's fine. So I think that one of the interesting things for me around that was that it came alongside the announcement about the Green Freeport in Aberdeen, which I think did have a lot of intergovernmental working and collaboration. So you had this sort of juxtaposition of a good example of collaborative working against one that didn't seem to involve much in the way of collaboration at all. Why is the UK government doing that? I think some of the reasons they're doing that are similar to some of the reasons that the previous government did that. The Conservative administration was more competitive against devolution, and I don't think we are seeing that from this government. But what they also did was want to increase the visibility of the UK government across the whole of the UK and seeing it as a legitimate thing to do as the government of the whole of the UK, following on very much from the recommendations of the report that Lord Dunlop made a few years ago. And I think this government very much sees that too. So I think it's part of the root of all of these things for me is a mismatch in the understanding of the legitimate roles of each administration. And one of the things I would like to see, we talked about, the government has talked about bringing forward a memorandum of understanding on the Sewell Convention. I would like to see them go back to the original memorandum of understanding, which is supposed to underpin all of the relationships, which has not been successfully reviewed since, I think, 2012 or 2013. There was an attempt to do it. It failed, partly because of that mismatch in understanding, but there are differences of view of what devolution means, about its scope, and about the extent to which the UK government should be intervening or having a role in areas that are otherwise devolved, including spending and commitments and regeneration and economic growth, which it sees as very much within its bag. So I don't think on your sort of initial observation about politics, I'm a political scientist, I don't think politics are ever out of the picture in intergovernmental relations. They're entirely political, certainly at the ministerial level, but what you can do is have processes in place that lie beneath that to support at least awareness raising, at least communication and co-decision where it's appropriate to do so. But I think we're not quite there yet with the processes, or some way far from being there with the processes that are in place currently around all of these things.
To come in?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the first comment to make, just picking up on where Nicola left, is on the politics, is that intergovernmental relations happens in every system that has some form of multi-level governance, and politics will always play a part. But politics and political tensions or differences in political policy or ideology need not preclude governments having to work together, because at the end of the day, you know, we are now dealing with big issues like climate change, like the eradication of poverty, that no government can do alone anyway. So that sort of, at times, politics has to be put aside, albeit that it still colours and potentially clouds intergovernmental relations. I think linked with that also is not to underestimate the importance of officials that are working behind the scene. The sort of civil service has often been referred to as the oiling glue in the system that keeps things going. And I think often when we see political tensions that are playing out, those relations are still happening sort of behind the scene. I think with regards to Pride in Place, I think, picking up on Nicola's point there, I think there certainly is an issue with the UK government not engaging properly with devolved governments. We saw this, and sort of Labour Party critiquing this when they were in opposition around the Shared Prosperity Fund. So it is, I think, slightly disappointing to see that there's not that engagement. But I think there's two things here. One, there's a lot of emphasis, particularly in Labour in England, on patriotism in the Union. For fairly obvious reasons, political reasons, and I think that remains important for them to show visibility of the UK government outside, across the whole of the United Kingdom. But I think linked with this, we're also going into an election period in two of the devolved nations, so I think that comes into it as well. But I think what there is probably, or there is certainly a mismatch between how different governments across the UK understand devolution. For the UK government, they and certainly the civil service as well, they see no issue with the UK government exercising or flexing its muscles or exercising powers in the devolved nations, because they are the government of the United Kingdom. And I think with regards to that reset, there's still a lot of work to be done, notwithstanding 25 years of devolution, to try and change the unitary mentality that I think still underpins how the civil service in Whitehall, but how also some government ministers understand devolution.
Can I just come back on that point? Because if you think back to Brexit, the Shared Prosperity Fund essentially was trying to replace the European funds which came before, and they, quite rightly, often wanted to identify themselves, the EU as a body, with these projects, so you saw the big signage. The point I'm trying to make is it goes way beyond the idea of the UK government just trying to say this is what we're doing in Scotland to make it self-relevant, which is quite legitimate. Can you imagine if in Scotland, 6 months out from a UK general election, we set up a fund and gave individual MSPs, sitting MSPs, a crucial role in deciding how those funds were dispersed, what the reaction of Westminster would be. I mean, I find this an extraordinary thing to have happened for implications with intergovernmental relations, interparliamentary relations as well. And just on your point about the politics, the examples that we've got in the submissions that we've received show, for example, in Germany, where the procedures and the practices seem to have been strong enough to basically withstand the political ebb and flow. That's my impression anyway, I don't know at first hand, but they seem to have the policies and processes in place where here they're ad hoc, they're one-sided, or they're absent completely in too many cases to be able to say there is proper intergovernmental working.
I think there's two things when it comes to intergovernmental relations. There's the processes and the structures, and then there's the political culture. And I think what we do have processes and structures in the UK that were traditionally, since the beginning of devolution or the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, for example, much more ad hoc under the Joint Ministerial Committee. We have a litany of reports that show this, and that's why the process in 2022 sought to formalise those relations. And I think those relations have been formalised, certainly. So those structures and processes are there. But the key point always about intergovernmental relations is if structures are one thing, if the people operating within them don't want those structures to work or are not keen on intergovernmental relations because of, for example, party political differences, they won't work. And I think what differentiates the UK, for example, certainly from Germany, but even other federal and multi-level governance systems, is that absence of what we would call in political science a federal political culture, that willingness to cooperate, to kind of operate on principles of consensus, partnership, equality, parity of esteem. That's what's lacking in the UK, and that has a huge impact when it comes to intergovernmental relations, because if you don't see if the UK government, for example, doesn't see the devolved governments as partners in the governance of the UK, then they're not going to engage with them as, for example, they ought to, or as you would see, for example, in another federal system. So I think that political culture is something that's not discussed so much, albeit certainly is in political science debates, but it is hugely important because it certainly conditions how intergovernmental activity operates and takes place.
Anything else?
What Paul said there, I suppose the one thing to maybe add, and I don't know what the Scottish Government's intentions are here. I know that the Pride in Place programme came a little bit as a surprise, but there is post-IGR review a dispute resolution process that doesn't rely on the UK government being able to deny the existence of a dispute. There was a change, that was one of the changes, the positive changes from the IGR review. So it would be interesting to know if they intend to use that route available to them through the formal structures that are there to raise this issue as a dispute.
Just say for information, I don't know what the Scottish Government's intentions are, but mine are to write to the Electoral Commission and to the presiding officer. That's a complete interference in the election process in Scotland. But on the general questions, I don't know if any other members of the panel have got any views on it.
I would endorse there's no surprise, is much of what's already been said. I think you're absolutely right. IGR is very difficult to get your head around as an academic, and I think also if you're an industry stakeholder, it's also very challenging. It's been said already. It's an evolutionary system. It's basically bricolage. We have things like the Council of the Nation and Regions just appearing, including city mayors and City of London mayor and things. And often we have things as well where post reset where we might have expected greater collaboration politically across the system, such as the designing of the terms of the internal market review, which were just again imposed. So there's a lot of politics here, and I think, as Paul said, this is part of intergovernmental relations. It's not unique to devolution up here, but I would stress that our system, even comparatively, is relatively weakly institutionalised. It's non-statutory and it relies very heavily on the quality of political relationships. So reset is a process, but it's not an arc of history. We're not necessarily bending towards something good. The current government could change, a future government could change in terms of the UK government, in terms of its engagement and willingness, both positively and negatively. One final point that I would stress, and it goes back to something you mentioned as well, there has been a change in IGR. There's been an evolution where IGR isn't necessarily about high-level dialogue or dispute resolution. There has, particularly since Brexit, been a shift to IGR as a space for actual policy making. And the internal market is one example of that. And I think it is interesting because it poses challenges to the Parliament and to the exercise of powers and legislative powers here in Holyrood. So I think that's, if you like, an even more aggravated tension in the emerging IGR landscape. And I suspect we might come back to talk about that in a moment. Thanks.
One last thing then, I'll maybe come back in if there's time afterwards, convener, but no other members want to come in. In relation to the Sewell Convention, it was mentioned in the papers that we have, I forget who it was that proposed that the idea of a designated committee within this Parliament to look at, I think it was LCMs, I think. Do you think there's any mileage in the idea in relation to the Sewell Convention to having a joint standing committee between this Parliament and the Westminster Parliament with members from both sides on it to try and ease some of the tensions around Sewell? I don't know if there's a precedent for it or anything like that either.
Possibly. It depends on what it would do. I think that there are a number of problems associated with the operation of the Sewell Convention even before we got to the point of it being set aside and the UK Parliament proceeding without consent. So that in itself is obviously the biggest issue. But there are also other things around timing and the devolved legislature has been given due consideration, due time to consider consent motions and the possibility of legislation changing further down the line after consent has been given. And, so there are all sorts of things to consider there. But I suppose, would a standing committee, what would it do? Would it agree together, or would it look at what then happens? I think the missing bit of the picture for me has always been what happens in the UK Parliament if consent is withheld. And the answer to that so far is, well, nothing. And I think that's if we want to bolster the Sewell Convention, I think I would want to see a bit more than just an MOU between the administrations. I think there is a role for the UK Parliament too to acknowledge whether or not it wants to recognise or in some way amend its process if consent is withheld from one or more of the devolved legislatures. So perhaps if a joint committee could do that and start to do that, then that would be a positive thing.
I suppose it might, and I've not thought this through, I must admit that, but I suppose the idea would be that if it was a committee that was recognised by both parliaments, its recommendations, if not binding, at least carried weight and had to be reported to both parliaments. And also the point you make about timing, which is we often get this very late in the day. If we had a designated committee, that could help with the timing of it, because it would go straight to considering it, whereas currently the relevant committee, this Parliament's got to try and get a meeting and fit it into its work programme. But just an idea. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, convener.
Did any of the other panellists want to come in? Professor Reid, and then I'll come to Dr Anderson.
I think just on that final point, there is a huge practical issue when we look at the number of supplementary LCMs that have to be here, because matters either there's continuing negotiation over the relations between the governments as a bill goes through Westminster, or there are changes at a late stage. Any sort of revised process would require fairly significant rethink of how things happen at Westminster in order to make it work.
Dr Anderson?
Thank you. I haven't spent... I spent a lot of time thinking about the Sewell Convention over the last few years, more than is healthy, probably. I don't have any strong sort of feelings towards a joint committee, but I think the disregards shown towards the convention since Brexit, which really was the catalyst that brought it into disrepute, no option should be off the table. I think sort of where I've come to in recent times is to really think about those parliamentary procedures when it comes to the Civil Convention. So certainly, I think I put this in the paper, but I've mentioned it before, is around the onus. It should be on the UK government when the Civil Convention is engaged, to engage with the UK Parliament, certainly to explain what steps it is taken to engage with the devolved governments. And this would have the benefit, of course, of then, first of all, having to consider the implications for the devolved institutions and explain what that means, particularly in the early stages of lawmaking, and sort of offer that opportunity to address any concerns. But also, when consent is held, then the UK government must explain to Parliament through a clear and transparent process whether proceeding without consent is the right thing to do. I think since Brexit, we've seen a significant tranche of legislation passed where devolved consent has been held. So I think they're exploring more parliamentary procedures to hold the UK government to account, particularly when it's proceeding with legislation where consent has been withheld, is important. And I think that, and sort of taking those steps, I think reforming the memorandum is certainly important, but perhaps there needs to be more tangible steps taken beyond this to ensure that the convention is sort of held within or protected and sort of entrenched as it should be.
Supreme Court that its view of the Civil Convention was it was merely a self-denying ordinance, and that undermines much of what people are trying to do to make it a more of a serious convention. But anyway, just a comment.
Yeah, Professor Horsley.
To add as well, I mean, Nicola and others in the room have written about this as well. It's a point more on substance than process. You know, we've been talking a lot about politics, and there's a lot of over-politicisation, I think, of devolution in terms of the relationships between governments. But again, when it comes to SUL, it would be really nice, I think, to see a hardening up of more of the substantives, you know, the not normally criteria. What does that actually mean? I think Nicola and I and others have been writing about this for ages and complaining, but it leaves an awful lot to politics just to leave that hanging, I think. So I think one of the things that would be quite nice if we could think about process issues, but also think about that hard question. When, for example, do we want the UK, under what conditions? Are they effects-based conditions? Are they linked to market analysis, you know, impact case studies, in the kind of when do we find a legitimate role for UK-wide intervention that perhaps isn't just political? And conversely as well, for the Scottish Government, if it's leaning on or leaning into a UK instrument, the justification for not bringing that forward here in Holyrood as well. I think there's probably some more work to be done in that space as well.
Professor McEwen.
Sorry, just very briefly. I noted in the Scottish Government's evidence to this inquiry, they talked about welcoming the proposal for an MOU to strengthen SUL and standing ready to assist. What that doesn't tell me is, what does the Scottish Government want? I mean, short of a veto, which isn't on the table, what does good look like in this space? And I suppose I would want to encourage the Scottish Government to be more vocal, and maybe it is being privately, but we're not seeing that. So what does good look like from the Scottish Government's perspective?
I think that's important, and I think the comparisons are very, very difficult, because if you take Germany, where it's a federal system, I mean, the federal government would dream of legislating in an area of devolved competency, and it is in statute. So, I mean, for the first 20-odd years of devolution, the SUL Convention worked very well, but it is a convention, and that's part of us not having a written constitution. But one of the other things that has been suggested, and Dr Anderson said nothing off the table, is that part of the problem is that there's, you know, England doesn't have a devolved parliament of its own, and there's this dichotomy where the UK government is for England, but also for the whole of the UK. So if you say nothing's off the table, is that something that you would want to explore?
Oh, that's for Paul.
Yeah, for Paul. Paul first.
Thanks, Nicola. So I think, you know, the reality, so when it comes to devolution, I don't think we should be. It's difficult to predict the future. The reality of an English Parliament and having an English government is not on the table. Certainly, and I'm doing a lot of work in this at the moment, that the direction of travel is mayoral combined authorities and regional mayors. So I don't think that's going anywhere. What is interesting, though, in this dynamic is that introduces a new intergovernmental dynamic when it comes to looking at how different governments view devolution. So I noted, for example, in the Scottish Government's evidence that they question the value of the Council of Nations in engaging with the mayors. In the work I've done with the mayors more or less see themselves on a par with the devolved governments in the devolved nations. They don't have the same powers, certainly, but performative-wise or leadership-wise, they're at that same level. So I think there's lots of interesting dynamics that certainly colour and condition how devolution develops in the UK.
Did you want to come in, Professor McKeon? Just finally on that, can SIL be put into statute? Is that possible?
Possible, but I think if you mean put into statute in the sense of legally binding and judiciable, then you are charging the Supreme Court with a particular set of responsibilities. I can't speak for the court. It may be one it doesn't want to accept, but you are going to end up with a resolution through the courts. And that, of course, brings its own very different dynamics to the resolution of some of these issues. But yes, I mean, there are no legal or constitutional obstacles to making that move. I suspect it's a direction in which we will not go, but it's not problematic.
Okay. Any further comments before we move on to questions from Mr. Kerr? Yes.
Right, okay, great. I missed my cue completely. Dear oh dear. I think part of the problem we've got here is the consequence of Brexit, isn't it? I mean, the convener herself said things were rolling along fairly calmly until we got to the point where we were legislating to depart from the European Union. And then all the working relationships that are necessary for this to work without statute, without some kind of statutory backdrop or backstop even, if I may use that term in the connection with departing the European Union, it just didn't hold up because all of the party political positioning kind of overwhelmed the need for there to be a cooperative spirit. And so when, Professor McKeon, you said in answer to a question a few minutes ago, we are not seeing it. I think that's part of the problem with all this in the governmental relations stuff. Everyone recognises there needs to be something, but we can't see anything. Because everything, and so I'm going to come to Paul Anderson first, because Paul said we have the procedures and structures. I'm really dubious about that, because I can't see the procedure, the processes and the structures. Everything, in your own words, is opaque. That doesn't lend itself to good working practice, does it?
No, but I think this is not unique to the United Kingdom. So intergovernmental relations, by their very nature, take place behind closed doors often. What we see is the photo opportunity, which is important. There's a symbolic aspect to that. We see the communiques, but we see what's been agreed in those communities between the governments when they're published. And maybe we will also see something behind the communiques when the people who are, or the politicians within those relations brief the media afterwards and may say something else. But, there are processes and structures in place. We have a machinery of intergovernmental relations. That architecture is there. That doesn't mean that it's functioning to the best that it should be, albeit it's functioning better now than it was before. But I think it's the political within it that's also important. So you can have, for example, you could put intergovernmental relations on a statutory footing and say that the Council of Nations has to meet 4 times a year. It doesn't mean that much is going to be discussed within those meetings. And I think the important thing is that often the formal meetings, those structures and processes, are not where things are discussed. The informal sometimes is much more important, and the sort of bilaterals and things that happen on the sidelines. So it comes back to that politics is always going to condition things.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I accept the fact that there has been formal, but, you know, we had the evidence recently from a UK government minister when we did our visit to London, where the evidence that was presented to us about how good the relationship was now after the reset between the UK and Scottish governments was that the Secretary of State for Scotland was out with this UK minister. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the name, am I? I am? Okay. Douglas Alexander said he was out with Ian Murray. They were riding about at a by-election campaign, and Ian got out of the car to find somewhere to have a call with, I can't remember who it was, Kate Forbes. I mean, if that's fine. I mean, we want to have a cordiality in the informalities of intergovernmental working, but that's not enough to sustain a modern state at all. So when you say we could have a statute that says, for example, a council meets 4 times a year, I mean, I don't see why we shouldn't have known train tracks that tell us when the next... I mean, I have no idea when the next... Does anyone know when the next council of nations and regions is? No, I mean, it's just ad hocery gone crazy, isn't it? I mean, we need to have some idea about what these structures are, and it needs to be open. And you're right about the photo op and, you know, John Swinney shaking hands with Keir Starmer and all the rest of it, but that doesn't add anything to our ability as a Scottish Parliament to scrutinise what the Scottish Government are up to in these meetings, because we don't know. That's a rant. No. Sorry. I find it very frustrating. I find it very frustrating that we all agree this doesn't work very well, and we need to do something different.
No, I think, and that's, so I think the informal, this is where so I think in the UK there's 2 problems. First of all, in the formal, and I said this in my evidence submission, we now know more of what's going on in these intergovernmental forums than before, and yet we still don't know that much. So things have improved, but we had a very low bar from the beginning. And if you have a look at the communiques, as I've spent time doing, they don't tell you much. But they
tell us there was a meeting. That's what they tell us.
There was exactly, and that's important. Although I don't think there has been a communique.
We wouldn't even know there'd been a meeting without a communique.
But I think the important thing around the the challenge of the informal is that it happens much more frequently than people would think, and there's no obligation on those informals. So, for example, if there's an informal bilateral between the Deputy First Minister and the Secretary of State for Scotland, there's no obligation that either of those figures have to report what was said in that meeting to a parliamentary committee or anything like this. So that's where parliamentary scrutiny becomes super difficult. So I think in the UK we're caught between a rock and a hard place, because it's difficult to scrutinise the formal meetings because we don't have a lot of information, and it's impossible to scrutinise the informal meetings because we don't know anything. Yes. So I think there is an obligation on that transparency and providing more information to Parliament and parliamentary committees to allow that to happen.
And depending on ad hocery, depending on culture, depending on the personalities. I mean, personalities obviously play a big part in politics. I understand that. And so if you've got a Michael Gove and a Fergus Ewing, they seem to get on really, really well, for example. Kate Forbes seems to get on with everybody she encounters in the UK government level. But that is not a structure at all, is it, upon which you can rest intergovernmental relations. And so I come back to something that Professor McEwen mentioned, which is something that I have a passion about, is the Dunlop review. Because Dunlop brought forward some very pragmatic ideas about how to structure the working relations between ministers in the different levels of government in the United Kingdom. And among the many suggestions he made was the idea of a secretariat. The fact there isn't a neutral secretariat to guide the path of these meetings, to set them up, to make them happen, to produce the documentation, that is a weakness. I'm doing a lot of speaking. I shouldn't be. You should be giving us evidence.
So there sort of is an independent secretariat, but it's not quite developing in the way that we might have envisaged.
Right.
And I don't want to speak for Lord Dunlop, but certainly that recommendation made me think of something a little bit more like the secretariat in the Canadian system, which is very visible, has a website. We know everything that's... So there is an impartial secretariat that is made up of representatives from all of the administrations that does help to arrange the meetings, it helps produce the communiques. It's not quite as established as one hopes it will be. Which
They won't
is
have a lot
the
to
reason,
do, will they, this group? Because the meetings are so
Well, I think they've got
irregular.
a lot to do because
Are
there's
they?
a lot of meetings and they have to produce the reports. So we haven't had a report since the election last year. So
Right.
we are due one.
So
for sure.
You take my point. You take my point, though.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Get your point. So, I mean, but the reports are probably more useful for us than they are for you.
Yes.
Because it's not that helpful, I think, for members to know that meetings took place 6 months ago. One of the recommendations that Corey and I had in the report that we did for you, for the committee and for the government, and this came through overwhelmingly from our discussions with members, and was that it would be much more helpful for members to know in advance of meetings, even if you don't really know when the meetings are going to take place. You can probably surmise that some will at some point. What is it that the Scottish Government wants? What's on the agenda? What are the priorities that it will try to take to that meeting? And I think so we've made a couple of pragmatic suggestions about how you might build that into the system of scrutiny within this Parliament in light of a revised agreement. And that, it seems to me, would be more useful from the perspective of parliamentary scrutiny of what the Scottish Government is doing and taking to its engagement with the UK Government. On your broader point about structures, I agree with you that structures are really important, and I also agree with Paul that the informal is really important, but having the regular structures helps to facilitate the informal.
Yeah.
If you know when things are coming up, you can start to build a relationship, and building a relationship is absolutely critical to building trust.
And sometimes
all of the
you
things
have
that
to
go around that.
force people together, don't you?
Yeah.
In the sense that it suits some politicians not to speak to each other and just to shout at each other through the broadcast and other media. I mean, the idea that there's going to be a meeting and therefore this preparatory work needs to be done, and then the post-meeting communiques and all the rest of it need to be done, doesn't that facilitate the fact that even when people don't like each other, when the chemistry is not good, the culture is not right, they still have to meet and speak?
Yeah. Mr. Kerr, I think Mr. Thompson wants to come in as well. But
Sure.
Possibly, but I think, what would be most useful, I think, in terms of the communiques and things, is that if we got a sense of what they discussed, not just the agenda items, which is what lots of them do just now, but what were the issues at stake and how were they resolved? Were they resolved?
Yes.
Because otherwise it's not really...
More transparency.
Definitely more transparency.
Yeah. Sorry, David.
What I wanted to pick up on was the thread that you were talking to there. I mean, if the Parliament here doesn't know what's going on, if the academics don't necessarily get the latest information and have to rely on stuff, can you imagine how difficult it is for businesses? Yeah. And that's the kind of point that is in my written evidence as well, our written evidence as well, which is really about clarity, about transparency, and about timescales. Yeah. And none of that's really there from a business perspective. Even if you're a large business, if you're a small business, if you're a medium-sized business, if you're an international business, you choose to invest based on confidence. Yeah. And one of the things that is really difficult for me to advise businesses on is being confident about the path of regulation, the timescale of regulation, and the impact of regulation. And I'm afraid the situation that we got to with the deposit return system has shot an enormous amount of confidence in businesses, because essentially what we had was a law that was passed in Scotland that businesses needed to comply with until they didn't. Yeah. And that, unfortunately, has brought the whole law into significant disrepute. Yeah. Because we don't have that clarity, structure and process that you're talking about, Mr. Kerr.
And
that's why
Mr. Kerr, I wonder if I could probe just a little bit more on that.
Well, can I follow up my question too?
Yes, okay.
Because the point that David Thompson's making is very pertinent to the whole issue of common frameworks. I think there's almost a mythological dimension to common frameworks. You can't have common frameworks if you don't have structures that sustain them.
So I would, I think our point of view about common frameworks is clear. There are a significant number of common frameworks that cover food, feed and agriculture. The working that goes on behind them seems to be pretty good because it's all kind of low level, at the official level.
Yeah.
But we have no idea what's discussed when and what decisions are made out of them.
Yeah, sorry.
So it was just in the area, I did mention Douglas Alexander, as did you. We're not picking on Mr Alexander at all. Indeed, in his previous ministerial role, he appeared in front of the IPF and we were able to discuss some of these issues with him. But it's just that thing about the visibility and what the public see and what the industry sees, because these are really crucial and important issues, and you might need confidence that the people sitting around the table are getting on with the job and doing it well. But in the context of an election campaign at the moment, when people are openly critical of one another's governments, of all these kind of things, what does that do for the confidence of the industry itself?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, business confidence in the food and drink sector is rock bottom at the moment. That's not necessarily anything to do with elections or anything like that. I think businesses are wise enough to understand that that's the game. Where it's really difficult, though, is where it is in essentially long-term projects that outlast electoral cycles. The whole world of plastics and packaging is a long-term project with multiple governments involved, with industry pretty much a cheerleader for a big chunk of it, but it's the timing and implication of that, which requires the Scottish and UK governments to work together, that has essentially shown us both the best and the worst of how that might work. So extended producer responsibility is being done on a four nations basis. That's proceeding. The bills are hitting with businesses just now. We might have an issue about how that money is then dispersed, but actually that's gone in a way that the four nations have worked very well together. DRS, no. And they're both part of the same part of regulation, because they're all about the plastics and packaging in the industry. And then you would add to that the UK plastics tax, which came first, but should really have come last. So all of that kind of thing, which is a long-term, 10-year project at least, there has been no clear structure, no clear timeline, and we're still in dispute with the Welsh Government, in this case, about their precise approach to it. And that's really difficult.
Yeah, thanks. I think Professor Horsley wants to come in. I'll come back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, just on some of the points we discussed, I think it's probably worth recognising a distinction as well when it comes to scrutiny and accountability, because there's a limit to what the Scottish Parliament can actually expect from IGR processes that are joint and in terms of the scrutiny. So I think endorsing Nicola's point and the excellent work in the report with Curry and my own written evidence as well, I think one of the things to think about is that the focus of the Parliament should be on scrutinising, to use Nicola's phrase, what it's taking to those processes and what it's bringing back. And I think that's really key to kind of bolster those aspects. And I think the common frameworks are mentioned as well, and I'm very sympathetic to the view that stakeholders, not just academics, are very much left in the dark about what's happening with these processes, and they are under review. One point I would stress, I think, to the committee is the UK government's commitment, and I think it's a shared commitment, to introduce greater space for stakeholder engagement in these common frameworks. That sounds very nice, and it works well, I think, in many levels, but it does have implications for the Parliament, because if you are effectively bringing in stakeholders into shared spaces towards the adoption of common policies, you're kind of legislating, or you're moving closer to making policy decisions and potentially taking them away from decisions here in this Parliament. So I think there's a lot at play here, and movements and improvements in IGR have to always be measured against the scrutiny concerns of this Parliament.
Thank you.
I've got two more questions, Convener, and obviously other colleagues want to come in, and if there's time, I've got 100 more questions, at least. My first question really is about joint scrutiny, and Keith Brown alluded to this, and I'm a very strong believer in the idea that we should cooperate across parliaments because we have so many areas of joint interest. Where else in the world does that happen? Where else in the world would members of a House of Commons Select Committee and a Scottish Parliamentary Committee and a Senate Committee, perhaps a Stormont Committee, come together in order to do a joint inquiry? Does that happen? How successful is it? How does it work?
It's really difficult to, I don't know is the honest answer to
Right.
some of the comparable systems, but Germany has been mentioned before, and that's a very different structure in that the representatives from the regional governments are in the national parliament.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're already doing that. So if you had, if there was to ever be a reform of the House of Lords to a Chamber of the Nations and Regions, for example, that's the sort of place that would facilitate that kind of joint scrutiny. There is precedent, though, at least in an ad hoc way, because I remember we hosted a meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee and the Social Security Committee here at the time post-2016, well, round about the time of the 2016 Scotland Act, where they were discussing the devolution of social security, where there was a shared interest there. So there have been definitely examples of that, but it's, I mean, much like other aspects of IGR in the UK, it's not systematic and it's not institutionalised. But I could go back and check and get a response to you for that.
Anyone else got any experience of or knowledge of these things? No, I think it's something that we as a committee have discussed, and we have met with committees or members of committees of the House of Commons and of the House of Lords. I think the scope for kind of coordinated inquiries, let's call it that, if not joint, is great, because one of the challenges we have here has been getting UK ministers to come and speak to committees with the regularity that I think we would like. So kind of joint approaches might actually work better, because constitutionally, of course, ministers are responsible to the Parliament that they sit in. And I understand that. However, it would be helpful if there was a more broad approach to this. My second question is to do with the EU-UK reset, which could also be another mythical creature for all I know. I'm just wondering about the consequences of agreements, particularly in the area of the food and drink aspects of any reset. Now, I don't know how near or far we are to having some kind of an agreement with the European Union, but undoubtedly one of the demands of the European Union will be that we operate in lockstep with their regulations. Now, setting aside the issue of whether or not we should be in lockstep at all, what I'm interested in is the consequence for this Parliament of that arrangement. Because on the basis of the reports we get, on the volume of regulation that would come our way, we would really struggle to do anything other than just nod at its coming and going. There'd be no scrutiny whatsoever. Can I have some commentary from those of you who have a view on this about the consequences of a lockstep regulatory agreement between the UK and the European Union on scrutiny and accountability and democracy? David?
Yeah, I won't go that far, but I'll talk about the practicality
yes,
of that,
of course.
which is there. So yes, food and drink is heavily regulated. There is a significant amount of regulation that happens at European level. Our current understanding from DEFRA and the Scottish Government is that if we are to follow dynamic alignment with Europe as part of the UK-EU reset, then yes, we would need to follow European regulation going forward. And yes, there would need to be a process for the adoption of that regulation across the UK, because food and drink is generally devolved. And what that seems to be in the initial phase is several hundred pieces of regulation, just to meet any framework agreement that might come. Already, because of the time that's passed since devolution, since Brexit, there is a significant delta of change there. So there's a huge untapped bits of regulation that have been brought in, some of which will have significant impacts on businesses in Scotland, significant negative impacts on businesses in Scotland. In general, though, the removal of some of the import controls with Europe will be, in general, better for the food and drink industry.
Sure.
But there will be issues which I'm sure this Parliament will talk about when we come to that. So yes, in practical terms, I would expect there to be a significant volume of regulation. Initially at least, and probably ongoing. And then, and this is for others to answer really, what ability you have to say no here or in the Senate or in Westminster is really unclear. And that's the bit where the ability to defend Scotland's or the UK's interests becomes a bit more difficult to understand where that will lie.
Well, we already know from when we were members of the European Union, we have no ability to say no. You sign up to the whole thing, and that's it. Yes. Do any of the academics want to comment?
Just on the broader issue about the UK-EU reset, I think the implications will be enormous.
Yes.
Of dynamic alignment. Possibly positive for a parliament that supported the idea of keeping pace, then it might facilitate that, for sure. But we don't yet know, obviously, what the reset will look like, but we also don't yet know what the process will be. But the expectation is that there will be a lot of secondary legislation coming through to maintain that dynamic alignment, if that is what is ultimately agreed, and that inevitably will fall a lot within devolved areas. So it's really important that there are, going back to when members of the European Union, the Joint Ministerial Committee Europe was the one that did meet regularly, that did have a schedule, that was the sort of exemplar of relatively good IGR. So having a system and a process that emulates that to ensure that there is at least input into the discussions, and having what was missing then, I think, is important now, to make sure that the Parliament has a role within that too, so that you are aware and engaging with Scottish Government ahead of those meetings. The timing issues that Colin mentioned earlier are going to be really important here as well, because a lot of this might land when Parliament is not sitting. So during the campaign, in the aftermath of the campaign next spring. So I think there's a real scrutiny gap there.
Could it come as soon as that, do you think?
Who knows? But who knows? But certainly it is a potential issue for the timing there, but it's an issue regardless. But
what about the volume?
I think it will be enormous. I really do. But the protocol agreement that you have here in place, and Thomas is going to speak to this, I think has potential there for what you can expect. I think it has a bit more heft to it than the written agreement as it currently stands. So I think you might want to use that as additional leverage.
And what about democratic accountability? The fact that we are going to be faced with a flood of regulations. I think volume is, we'd all agree it's huge. We can't reject any of it. The scrutiny of it is probably rubber stamping. Does not undermine the very basis of the Parliament. I mean, we talk a lot about, democratic deficits, or some of us do, and this would be a huge democratic deficit, wouldn't it?
So the UK government took the decision that it wanted to leave the European Union at the same time have regulatory alignment. Now, that comes at a price, and the price is democratic accountability at that level, because they're no longer at the table. That was a political decision or a referendum decision. Now, that has knock-on effects for this Parliament when it comes to that process, and that's why it's really important to try and at least get the input processes right, and make sure that the Parliament has a role in that respect.
I mean, the issue of take it or leave it and comes to dynamic alignment will be determined by the agreement that is reached, but you could end up in a Norway position where take it or leave it doesn't just apply to this Parliament, it applies to the UK in the sense of what's on the table.
Well, it would do, wouldn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got if you're using the language of deficit and democracy as a political choice, it's a double. In our system, it's a double hit, if you like. But I think in terms of practical things you can do, assuming, of course, that any dynamic alignment structure does give space for the Parliament to consent to secondary legislation, then, as Nicola mentioned, you have the model of the protocol, which does have teeth, and I think would be a useful instrument in that sense.
But ultimately, we couldn't reject secondary legislation that came to us as a regulation from Brussels, could we?
it will, to the extent that even if you have a consent mechanism under our system, the extent to which it binds anyway. But the point is, I think procedurally...
That is genuinely an academic point, isn't it?
but procedurally, I think, and also practically, you're absolutely right. I think practically as well, you're going to have a situation where you may have a procedural, I don't use the language of formality, but you have a procedural process through which at least some degree of scrutiny can be undertaken.
But to no effect, that's the point, isn't it?
It will depend on the design of the instrument that's negotiated, and also on what the UK ultimately agrees. Because there is, in a world in which the UK may have some input, some opportunity to manage the alignment, to influence. I mean, there isn't a model that currently exists in relationship to the EU, but it is.
Have you met the European Union?
I
don't think that
they
don't think they would accept any of that, would they?
I have spent many a year working on European Union topics, and I'm fully aware of the dynamics that animate European policy making. But it is a concern, and it is a concern for this Parliament. And I think there are probably realistically limits to what can be done. But there are processes and mechanisms which I think Nicola said can be modified, expanded, and usefully applied.
And the concern that Professor McEwen has shared is that this could all fall next March when we're not here. Is that an informed view, or is that just a concern that you have?
It's wholly speculative.
Speculative.
I don't know when,
okay.
It's going to fall.
I thought you had an inside track.
I think it's reasonable to assume that period is at least a period of important negotiation. When the Parliament will be sitting and able to scrutinise.
That will be as opaque as the other stuff we've been speaking about, I suspect. Those are my two questions for the moment. I can come back if we have time.
Mr. Bibby.
Thank you, Convener. We've heard obviously a lot this morning, but the governments don't tell us things, and governments don't tell the Parliament information. They don't tell the industry things that have been discussed as well. And I think generally I would say that as an opposition politician, even outside intergovernmental relations, I don't think transparency is the Scottish Government's strong point. Now, don't get me wrong, I think probably opposition politicians at Westminster would say the same about the UK Government, and probably opposition parties in any parliament would say that about their government. So it would be nice if the government's just told us things. That would be nice, and that can be correct. We do need to see transparency. But to what extent are we, and then obviously we do need to look at modifications of the way we run our processes, but to what extent within the current system that we've got, is this parliamentary committee and other parliamentary committees in the Scottish Parliament doing enough to not, obviously we are discussing this, we have done work, and thank you for all your contributions to that, but to what extent do we as a committee or committees of this Parliament need to up our game in terms of this transparency generally? And I'm sure we won't take it personally if you think we need to do more currently as is, using the mechanisms and processes we have to improve scrutiny and transparency of intergovernmental relations. I don't know who wants to go.
Shall I? So when you asked us to review the written agreement, that's an opportunity, I think, and I know that work is paused just now because of this inquiry, which I think is another opportunity for the committee to shape what comes next and to have an agreement that is more meaningful about the kind of material that is shared, the point at which it is shared. So, for example, we gave consideration to the impact of UK Internal Market Act on the process of lawmaking and policy making, and I don't see any reason why there can't be an assessment shared with committee at the outset of when it may be the case that there is an internal market interaction. So that's the sorts of things, it's about the timing of when things are shared. And it's tricky because, as Thomas mentioned earlier, Common Frameworks has become a place where policy is made, not just issues negotiated further down the line. So it is important for governments to have a space to try to formulate and make policy. But I still think you can get things earlier. And some of the recommendations, or not the recommendations, sorry, the outcomes of the internal market review and the process of using common frameworks more there, if you look at that, it does give you points of opportunity for when things can be shared with the committee from the Scottish Government, where they're taking things through that process. I don't see any reason why there can't be more transparency at that point. I don't think it undermines any negotiation tactic that they might have.
Any other?
I would agree with Nicola, and merely add as well, there's potential to do, and I'm not suggesting that I necessarily agree with this or otherwise, but there are potential to do some things which have been mooted in other devolved parliaments, and one of them, I think Nicola's absolutely right, it's about getting the timing at the earliest point. One of the things, for example, when I was thinking around these issues and talking to people is, think about the standing orders when you introduce bills. You have to provide a policy memorandum with impact assessments and things. And one of the things that struck me, and it's in my evidence as well, I think you could reform Standing Order 9.3 and say there's a requirement when introducing a bill to make a statement about likelihood of engagement with IGR processes, particularly the common frameworks. So you've got sort of an alert, if you like, built into the legislative process. So, I mean, we do that for the Human Rights Act, we do it for various other things. I think it could just be limited to the Internal Market Act. That would work nicely, but I think it could be broader. You could say, there's an anticipation that in order to get this legislation through or to develop it, we will be engaging or expect to engage through IGR processes, and at least puts everybody on alert, including industry, that they know that's coming. Because I think, as Nicola said, timing is essential when we're talking about scrutiny of IGR.
Yeah. Just now come to you, Mr. Thompson. Thanks.
Sure, thank you very much. I think beyond the timing, which I agree with Thomas and Nicola, is important. I think there's other sort of procedural or structures that are important. So I think that the first thing is the committee should continue to investigate and look and examine intergovernmental relations. I think, just as we were saying earlier, the fact that these forums and meetings are taking place raises the salience of how important intergovernmental relations are. So too does parliamentary scrutiny, specifically on intergovernmental forums or specific issues. So I think that's important. I think one of the interesting things, picking up on the point that Mr. Bibby made regarding opposition not necessarily knowing what's going on, there is or occasionally an issue here around confidentiality, and certainly, for example, I gave evidence last year, I think, to the Senate Finance Committee on intergovernmental relations regarding finances, and there, of course, as we know, spending reviews are hugely important, but if you are parties in opposition or even not, then there's confidentiality issues there. So I think it's hugely important to build up that trust, and perhaps even, for example, explore opportunities of having closed shop meetings with government ministers. I think that there's two other things here. The first thing is building good relations with respective ministers is hugely important. So there is, if we look across different committees, quite a significant difference in how ministers report intergovernmental relations. And sometimes this is quite formal, where ministers send a very detailed 2, 3, 4-page letter to the committee laying out what was discussed in certain forums. And that is an example of good practice. But I think also, picking up in that informal stuff that I talked about earlier, there's nothing to stop the committee having an informal meeting with the minister to find out what was discussed, because I think that's where you can sort of get to the crux. And I think also, picking up on the point we mentioned earlier about interparliamentary relations, there is, I think, then an incentive to think more deeply about interparliamentary relations. One of the things that as the committee will know, and every other committee knows, it's very difficult to get a UK government minister to come in front of a committee. And often this is dismissed based simply on timings, that the minister or Secretary of State doesn't have the time. Well, if you have committees from the House of Commons, Stormont, the Senate and the Scottish Parliament coming together, then the Minister just has one engagement with different committees. Now, they may not want to do it, but I think there's merit there in exploring more where Parliaments horizontally can work better together to hold governments to account when it comes to intergovernmental relations.
Mr Thompson?
I just wanted to emphasise, I think, the importance of, going back to my earlier points and what people have said, the importance of the clarity and timing. So if there's anything this committee, the Scottish Parliament committees can do, it's to make sure that when there is an interplay, in particular from our perspective with the Internal Market Act, that is clear and understood from day one. And the timing of that is clear and understood from day one. And the implementation of that is clear and understood as much as possible from day one, because that's the thing that gives business confidence. The deposit return system situation is both the poster child for the Internal Market Act and also completely the wrong example, because it was an interaction with regulation that was already in train and the Internal Market Act. But if you were to be presented with that situation now, which you will be more and more, one would imagine, then, you know, scrutinising and testing the Scottish Government in its proposals on the interaction with the Internal Market Act, on the timing of that decision-making process, and then on the implementation of the Act as a whole, would be a really important, I think, addition to scrutiny of these constitutional issues.
Okay. Yeah, Professor Reid.
I think this discussion has put me in mind of a wider discussion that the Delegated Powers Committee was having in relation to framework legislation about at what stage is it the best stage for the Parliament to get involved in. Because with framework legislation, when the bill goes through, it's an open book, so you can't really do in the detail. By the time the legislation comes through at the end, well, all the discussions have been had, all the policy decisions have been made, and there's this sort of gap in the middle. And that's parallel with what's been talked about here, that where the Parliament perhaps needs to be more involved is as policy is being shaped, and finding the opportunity, finding the means to do that before you have decisions that are more or less set in stone and very hard to change. That's the challenge.
Okay. Mr Bibby?
I don't have a further question, but just to thank the panel for their answers there, because I do think it's clearly a challenge for us, and I think in other areas of policy outside intergovernmental relations, when Parliament needs to fight for transparency, you know, parliamentarians and committees need to be quite tenacious about these things, and I think there is a role potentially for us to be asking, you know, more questions about what's coming to get that time and to get the clarity that you mentioned.
Thank you. Mr Ackle-Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks to me. Morning to the panel. I was going to be looking at some of the kind of what I hope maybe some of the kind of practical kind of sides, and we've just been talking about some of the suggestions that have come up, and I had a kind of angle that I was going to look at, and really some of the contributions that just happened there, just took place there, kind of set me off on a number of different areas. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to kind of bring this to some sort of kind of focus. But effectively, if I can come to Professor McEwen first, you were talking about, I mean, we've been talking about timings and transparency and kind of awareness. I'm not aware if the Scottish Government has to publish publish, say, a list of meetings that ministers are having every week. Are you aware of anything like that? It's almost like a kind of court circular. You know, the Minister for will be meeting.
No, the written agreement does commit to reporting on intergovernmental meetings, formal intergovernmental meetings, which they have interpreted as being within the formal structures,
right,
which, as we know, is not where most of the meetings take place. So one of the recommendations that we made was that you include all of the intergovernmental engagement, the formal intergovernmental engagement, within that reporting requirement to aid scrutiny. But that's only one step, so that in itself isn't really going to tell you very much.
Sorry, was that ahead of meetings, or was that reporting by us after the meeting had been held?
So the written agreement commits both. What we found in the evaluation that Corey and I did was that there's very rarely advance reporting. And part of that is because often it's quite last minute. And a lot of the scheduling and things is not within the gift of Scottish Government. I think the expectation is that the Independent Secretariat will take on some of that more routine reporting of things taking place, when they're taking place, and that kind of thing. And ideally, you probably want that sort of basic level of information to be handled in that way. But what's more useful, I think, for the Parliament is getting a little bit more of the meatiness of, you know, what's the meeting for?
Yeah.
What are the issues coming up at stake, and you know, what were the outcomes? And I think the reporting afterwards, that usually in the form of a letter from the relevant minister to the committee, has been a bit better in some respects. So the Finance Committee is probably a good example of where that's worked quite well. And I think that that informal relationship that I think Paul was mentioning, the informal relationship between the committee and the ministerial team, I think is also really helpful there. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that for sure.
So, I mean, as an MSP, if a minister visits my region, I get notification, and sometimes it's a long time ahead, and others it's the day before, and you kind of understand that ministerial diaries change. And obviously, as you just highlighted, it's not always at the gift of the Scottish Government when those meetings take place. I mean, would it be an ambition to, would it be, I suppose, an aspiration to have any meetings notified as soon as they're made available, and then perhaps a follow-up, a statutory duty perhaps to report on the details of those meetings where possible? I understand from what Dr. Anderson said that there may well be areas that can't be covered because of confidentiality, but would that be something that would be helpful in providing the transparency that we need and that we don't have?
So that's already in the written agreement. Right. So I suppose the question is, why isn't it happening?
Yeah.
And I think one of the answers to that is the sort of burden on officials for that, gathering that information and who reports that. And, you know, Scottish Government is a big organisation, and you might have one small team of 2, let's say, doing that sort of reporting. So that's, although it sounds like a really small thing, in administrative terms, it's probably a task. I suppose you have to question, is it a valuable addition to what you would have? And I think it certainly helps to know when meetings are taking place, to be able to enable yourselves to then ask, well, what happened? But by itself, I don't think it will take you very far, but there's certainly no harm.
Is there a risk? Because I mean, we see it sometimes with FOI requests that go in, that an organisation can determine that it's too expensive, too much time for the response. If there is that kind of flexibility, that or practical flexibility, I suppose, that we're not getting that kind of reporting information back, is there a tendency or the risk that government may not therefore provide the full details because it's seen as too much of a administrative task to deliver?
I mean, I guess, but I think it's still important for committees to know the details of the engagement that's taking place to enable your scrutiny function. I think so. One of the recommendations, I was trying to find back our recommendations, Corey. I think one of the suggestions that we had made was that a lot of the detail be put online, just routinely, so that you're not then relying on a small team of officials trying to ask their colleagues in, you know, a wholly other bit of government, well, when did you meet? What's coming up? You know, and that, I think there are other ways around that. If the processes internally are just facilitate that easy reporting, and then that might be then more accessible and transparent for committees.
Well, that's why I was wondering whether there was that kind of process in place where once a meeting was proposed or confirmed, that went online, and then there was a duty to provide the information in the minutes, which moves me on to another point in terms of concerns over the actual recording of what happens. I mean, we talk about, obviously, I think panelists talked about perhaps some of the detail when it is published or is provided isn't always particularly detailed. Do we know that information is being recorded in detail? We're only seeing a small part of it, or in some cases there's a concern that perhaps the focus on providing full minutes, full information isn't being undertaken.
So we don't know for sure, but I suspect there is a fuller minute somewhere. And there was the first incarnation of the Joint Exchequer Committee that sort of met for a while and then didn't, again, this was at the time of the 2016 Act, produced really quite full minutes that were really interesting for me as an academic, because it did actually give you insight into what the issues were and the reason why that committee stopped meeting, because they weren't able to resolve it in that forum. The roof didn't fall in when those meetings were published, and I don't see any reason why you can't air more of the content of discussion. I'm sure there are some things that is appropriate for governments to keep confidential, but I think they can give more than they currently give.
So essentially, the aim of government should be to publish what is available, except under perhaps exceptional circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good way to look at it, is to have the default position of you be transparent unless there is a good reason not to be.
Thanks very much. Dr. Anderson, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Yeah, thank you. I think, so like Nicola, my assumption would be that there are minutes taken at these meetings, and of course I don't think it's likely that they're ever going to be published in an online space, particularly given around issues around confidentiality. But again, I don't see why there cannot be an agreement that parliamentary committees scrutinising specific policy areas or intergovernmental relations in general don't get access to these. I think what's interesting, if we have a look at the communiques, is there is a difference. So generally the communiques coming from, for example, the interministerial groups basically say, here were the representatives that attended the meeting, here's 3 things that were discussed. There is, however, if you have a look at the interministerial group for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, they, and this is a committee that seems to be the leading one when it comes to best practice, they provide normally fairly detailed summaries of what's been discussed. That includes agreements by ministers on action points and sort of gives plans for future discussion. I haven't seen this in any other forum, and I think that is a good example, because that means that things are saying, we discussed this, the Secretary of State agreed that they would go and we look at it, and that means at the next meeting we can ask the Secretary of State for an update on this. So I think there's not a level playing field across what we're seeing from this, but there is potential, and I think there is. If we're talking about democratic deficits that we've talked about earlier, I don't think many members of the public are reading communiques of intergovernmental relations. I think that's academics and parliamentarians. But I think it's important there is a detailed record, particularly as Nicola mentioned earlier, we don't have the reports. We're still waiting on reports from intergovernmental relations from before, of a couple of years ago. So I think there is a duty to, or there should be a duty and obligation to say more in those communiques or reports about what's been discussed.
That's interesting. So perhaps, as I say, perhaps some sort of more, because you talk about consistency and there's a lack of consistency in between different groups. Perhaps more something which lays out in more detail a timeline would be perhaps helpful. Can I come just because I don't want to deny Stephen Kerr his 100 questions he's still got to go.
I might.
That was really just giving the convener an opportunity to manage expectations. We talked very briefly about the civil service, and obviously the civil services have to. We talked about, I mean, a neutral secretariat. I would hope maybe that the civil service would provide that anyway. I mean, that is meant to be the. I suppose one of the questions I was kind of look at is the role of the civil service. We've talked about as I say, the lack of consistency, perhaps within how reports are being delivered, or information is being provided. Is there a concern, I suppose, that once you've had a government in place for quite a long time, and we obviously saw it with the last UK government being in for 14 years, the current Scottish government has been in for 18 years, that civil service becomes more tied to the government of the day, particularly as say there's been a time, and therefore that independence of the civil service is anyway impacted. If I can come to Dr. Anderson first, and then whoever else may want to comment on that.
Yeah. So in truth, I don't have an answer on sort of the independence of the civil service. My hunch would be that the civil service operates as an independent, but that doesn't mean that they're not they don't get used to a certain minister's ways of working or a government's way of working. But I think the important thing when we're looking at intergovernmental relations are you can have political tensions playing out in the media or social media or however we see them. Intergovernmental relations happens every day behind the scenes. It goes on, and that's officials that are keeping that going. So I mentioned earlier that we see certainly academics in analysis of IGR. We see the civil servants as the oil and glue of the system because we have a unified civil service where good relations are sort of built up, and those relations, that trust is so important. It's something that I think is underestimated a lot because where you may have mistrust between different political parties in power, that doesn't necessarily trickle down to the civil service that have to keep things ticking along anyway. So I think the civil service play a hugely important role in keeping things going when there are political tensions, and those informal relations and the trust building there is hugely important to keep intergovernmental relations developing.
So the day-to-day, the bread and butter of IGR is happening. It's probably happening better than we see, but perhaps the issue from our point of view as parliamentarians is we're not seeing enough of that. We're not seeing enough of the decision-making processes at the first.
Yeah, exactly, because I think what we're seeing, when we look at communiques, we get communiques from the political discussions of the politicians that have met. When we look at common frameworks, it's mostly officials that are sort of negotiating and working through common frameworks, but the officials are not there's no obligation for this, and I'm not saying there should be, but so this stuff ticks along anyway. It's officials behind the scenes that are keeping things moving. So I think that's when we're looking at reports or intergovernmental detailed minutes and things like this, it's the political discussions, but those official to official discussions are happening every day, notwithstanding party political differences or tensions over policy or other issues.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the other panellists want to comment.
Clarification. So the Independent Secretariat, the impartiality there is that it's made up of people who came from each of the administrations, but it doesn't. Those individuals don't act for the administrations, right. So they work as a collective, serving all of the administrations together. That's what I meant by the impartiality in that case.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Just before I give the members an opportunity for final questions, I wonder if I could return to the issue of dynamic alignment. So obviously Northern Ireland's in a position of having to have had dynamic alignment with the Good Friday Agreement, but Wales and Scottish governments both had a commitment to the keeping pace powers. So is there a significant difference with the challenges of a dynamic alignment across the UK on those different situations? And Mr Thompson, I'll come to you first.
Well, at the moment, not fundamentally a difference, because we haven't really seen action based on the keeping up with the regulations. Certainly in our space, that hasn't been the case, despite there having been multiple regulations at European level. They haven't come here for various reasons, some of which are political and some of which are practical. So in that kind of case, I don't see there being a difference. And of course, if we go back to before Brexit, we had to implement European regulations. It's just we did have an opportunity to influence them previously. So at the moment, I don't see a particular difference in different parts of the UK. There are a couple of areas where that has been more pronounced. So, for example, the issue of genetic modification, which the UK government have wished to pursue, Scottish government have not. So there are those kind of tension points, but those are really quite limited in the time since we've left the European Union.
Okay. I'll take Professor Reid, then I'll come back.
I think one of the aspects here is partly the timing issue again, because of the timing of the European elections, that there was a rush of stuff that was agreed just before the EU elections, but the implementation periods haven't bitten yet, so we're still in that gap. So the fact that any bit of the UK has or hasn't gone into alignment doesn't mean it's actually we're rubbing up against EU law, but there's only so many months left by the time which all the member states should have the laws in place, and we're still in that period. So I think there'll be a bit of a rush in the next couple of years where we'll suddenly find, if nothing happens in any part of the UK, you'll find you're more out of step than you are just now, in quite a rush.
Professor McEwen.
So I think there is a difference. In the keeping pace commitment was just that, a commitment, a choice. And in the case of dynamic alignment, that will be taking place somewhere else, probably through lots of secondary legislation that the UK government may lead on in devolved areas. And I think your example of Northern Ireland is really interesting here, and I think there's a lot to learn from how that's operated in Northern Ireland, where there is quite a significant deficit, a democratic deficit in the role of the Assembly in this space. There is, I can't remember the detail of it, Thomas, you probably remember more than me, but there is an opportunity as a last resort for the Assembly to block, but it would undermine and jeopardise the whole agreement that they have, so it's very unlikely that would take. So there is quite a profound feeling of a democratic deficit, and I think it is something to be mindful. And maybe then, if learning from Northern Ireland in cooperation, excuse me, that some of that horizontal cooperation that Paul talked about with the Senate as well, it might be appropriate to try and get ahead of the game and try and think about what might that look like from a devolution perspective, about making sure there is a role for the devolved legislatures in that process.
Okay, does anyone else?
I just sort of on that brief point, I think the Northern Ireland context experience is useful, but it is one of those examples where we are dealing with the asymmetry of devolution. So there are limits to, I mean, Nicola, the particular process Nicola referred to has its context in Northern Ireland, and it's not something that's going to be addressed here. I think the broader point is that it's going to shift from a system of kind of optionality and voluntary keeping pace as a commitment which this Parliament could overturn, should it so wish, to something that we've mentioned earlier around an obligation to adopt. But I think asymmetry does play quite a part there if we're comparing with Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Mr. Kerr.
I'm going to shock my colleagues by reading the room and only asking one question. I'll leave the 99 for another occasion. And my question really is quite broad, and it's just to revisit Eukema, because we've talked about Eukema before in the committee. But given what I've heard you say about Eukema today, do you expect there to be any change at all in the legislation, Eukema's, the actual act, or do you think any changes that come about will be around the ad hocery that we were discussing earlier in terms of how people speak and signal to each other about how to deal with issues that might arise? And I'm going to come to Professor Horsley, because you've written a bit about this, haven't you?
I think if you look at the text of the Eukema as it currently stands, the text references it references the common frameworks as an intergovernmental space. What we have seen, based on what the UK government is currently proposing, is not a revision of the legal text, but a revision of the intergovernmental space. So in terms of changing the actual text, I don't think it's necessary to implement what the UK government's proposing. And I suspect there may not be a change to the legal text, which, of course, it looks like everything's going to be taking place in the intergovernmental space through principally a revision to the common frameworks and agreements on loosening some of the constraints there and improving, not necessarily perfectly, some of the timing and evidenced issues that were raised.
So no legislative change, but
it's possible, but it's not necessary to implement what is being proposed.
What they're proposing, which is more to do with the space of things that we talked about at the outset of the session. So that's
possible, but not necessary.
All right. Okay. Does anyone Ailsa.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that means it's ad hocery. So
I'm being dismissive.
So I know, but so you can have an intergovernmental space that is clear and institutionalised, the term that we might use, so that has a set of processes that everybody understands and everyone abides by.
Non-statutory, though.
It can be statutory, but it's probably more likely to be non-statutory.
Yeah.
The problem I have at the moment with the outcome of the review of the UK Internal Market Act is that we still don't really understand how that will operate. So we know, for example, that they will consider a broader set of issues around when thinking about an exclusion. So beyond just economic impact, they are now open to considering environmental impact or public health impact, some of the other things that might be seen as legitimate policy objectives and reasons for divergence. But we don't know who will do that evaluation. We don't know what the evidence base will be. We don't know how you will, because there's always a trade-off. We don't know how you trade off the economic impact from the public health impact. There's nothing in the review document as it stands. So again, if I was, from this committee's perspective, I would want to push more on it's fine for things to be in the intergovernmental space, but provided there is transparency about how you do that, what is the process, what is the rule, what is the timing, and all of these things.
Possibly a bigger role for the Office of the Internal Market.
Well, I don't know if the
that
Office
would be
of the
institutional
Internal...
almost, wouldn't it?
So the Office of the Internal Market, I think, will have a role in the economic impact bit, but is that the appropriate body to have a role in assessing the environmental impact or the public health impact? I'm not sure that's necessarily the expertise of the OIM. No. Again, who will do that, and where does power lie in determining which bit of evidence and which bit of impact outweighs the other? So there's lots still to be clarified there.
That's very useful and very helpful. Yes, Professor Reid.
Can I just raise that there's a separate issue about the Act that may come into prominence in future, which is actually the follow-through, not the decision-making, but the follow-through. The example is the glue traps. The sale of that were banned in Scotland. Former UK government decided they wouldn't give an exemption. I believe it was in December 2024 that the current government in London said that they were happy to grant an exemption, and there's no legislation yet.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, what the delay is.
Here, you mean?
No,
Anywhere.
There was a letter in December from the UK government saying they were now happy to grant an exemption.
Yes.
But that has not been carried through into legislation.
Right.
So I don't know what the hold-up
December.
What the hold-up is. And it seems a very long time to implement that decision.
Very good.
And if there is going to be more exemptions, then if the revised process is going to allow for more exemptions,
this is the point
timescale for following through is another issue that's going to have to be addressed.
Yeah, so there's one thing about how you get to the decision, and then do you do anything because you've made a decision? Yeah. And just, David, I'm sure that your view would be that you want some clarity about getting in the room when it comes to common frameworks.
Getting in the room would be lovely, though I understand the points that were made, and there is a need for governments to talk to government directly and without an audience of stakeholders. But what is going to be discussed in these meetings, what decisions are made in these meetings, and then what then follows,
if anything's done,
is really, really important. And as much advanced knowledge of that as possible is really, really important.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
For the remark to Mr Thompson said earlier on about the DRS scheme, the law was made, people expected things to happen, then it was struck down. I think one of the concerns of this committee has been the chilling effect that has on any proposals being considered in government, because you don't know whether they're going to be struck down or not. And that chilling effect is quite profound. It'll be interesting to see what impact it has on the parties' manifestos actually in the coming piece for the election. I had two questions, but I'll still expect to take less time than Stephen Kerr did. The first one is for Professor McEwen. In our submission, you made the statement that the Westminster Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, has less interest in IGR, especially at the portfolio level, and has demonstrated less interest than the devolved legislatures in scrutinising the UK Government's intergovernmental activity, which is followed by a statement saying, in your view, transparency and accountability can be best increased by strengthening the requirements upon the Scottish Government to report on its activity in IGR. Now, I'm all for haranguing the Scottish Government to do more, but surely when that level of apathy at Westminster towards IGR is evident, then the Scottish Government can continually try to increase its transparency, but to what effect if Westminster is apathetic?
The first of those. So I don't think that's true of the Lords Committee on the Constitution or, is it still called PACAC, the Public Administration Committee, so your equivalents. What I meant there was, if you take, for example, a committee that's looking at employment or energy or social security, they're principally concerned with what the UK Government is doing in that space within its areas, which is a natural thing for them to do. I'm not sure that they are, that it's necessarily on their radar that there is a devolution intersect with those sorts of issues. So trying to get a handle on what the UK Government is doing in that space, I'm not sure there's even the awareness or necessarily the interest in thinking that's something that the committee should be doing. And that's maybe where there is value in the interparliamentary work, because you can raise that awareness with your colleagues in the Westminster Parliament to help to raise that awareness of why this matters and why the intergovernmental space matters. So I think there's definitely benefits in that. But they're two separate points. So I think that the point about the Scottish Government's reporting on its activities is to enable this Parliament to do its job, to enable this committee and the other committees to scrutinise what they are taking to intergovernmental meetings, to try to get a better understanding. What came through really clearly in the interviews that we were doing with members, that there just wasn't really enough understanding of what it was they were trying to get out of the relationship. And that, I don't think, was a party political point. I think it was just a frustration. So I think there's more that can be done there to raise awareness among members here about where there are intersections with UK legislation, whether it's UKIMA or something else, because devolution has become a lot more complicated post-Brexit and post-2016 Act, but also just to give a bit more insight into what matters to the Scottish Government in the intergovernmental space. The Welsh Government have done more traditionally in that space than the Scottish Government has. I think IGR has maybe been politically a bit more challenging for the Scottish Government, where its priority is about self-government and having the space to do to exercise its own self-government and its own political autonomy. So I think it has been a little bit more of a difficult space, but there is recognition now, I think, that there's so much complexity in the system that you have to be able to navigate that.
I remember when I changed my mind on the Knockcroven verdict, it was because when I found out that it was not possible for sheriffs or judges to explain to jurors what the Knockcroven verdict meant as opposed to not guilty. Similarly, I think going back to Stephen Kerr's point, if this is so complex, so full of exceptions and agreements and conventions which are not observed and all the rest of it, if the public, I'm not saying the public want to know the detail of the internal machinations between governments, but if they can't, there's no prospect of them getting a reasonable understanding of it. I think that's when you have to say the system's not working. And just on the point, if the Westminster Parliament is apathetic about it, until it asserts its interest in IGR, you're going to continue to get what we're told elsewhere are decisions which are UK government positions rather than UK-wide positions, which is what I think we'd all want to see happen. Anyway, on the point about Scottish Government scrutiny, and going back to a point that Hugh Halko-Johnson made, I think the idea that FOI is a vehicle, FOI has become to some extent discredited. It's been abused so much. You get screeds of hundreds of FOI requests put in by parliamentary researchers, which I think is undermine the process. Plus, it shouldn't really be the initiative of individual MSPs to have to ask for this information. I understand what you say about the time taken, well, the time taken for FOIs now, which is one reason why people want to ask hundreds, is astronomical. It's about 120 quid, I think, an answer at least. But surely, when the Scottish Government previously agreed to publish its ministers' diaries, which it does proactively because it saves, I think, because it saves on FOIs coming and having to ask us all the time, surely that resource could be tweaked to say that if a minister met with a UK minister or a Welsh or Northern Ireland minister, you could star that and you could just extract that from the system to say these are the meetings that we're aware of that have taken place between ministers at an intergovernmental level. That wouldn't be such an onerous thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, whatever is done, whether it's that or whether it's the website hub that we suggested, I think being cognizant of the impact on officials is really important, because I think your FOI example has created challenges internally. It's not a judgment on FOI, but it's just in terms of the administrative impact that has. That's something I think you would want to avoid in this space.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that exhausts questions from the committee this morning. Can I thank you all for attending? It's been a really interesting session as always, and on that note I'm going to close this meeting of the Parliament. Thank you. That's us done today.